So we've seen the structure of plant cells in general, and this topic covers the way the plant cells can be different from each other. So when cells differentiate, that means they start from a general purpose cell, and they take on specific functions by taking on different shapes and characteristics. And I like this illustration here. This is a cross section through a leaf, rather specialized plant. So it's got the underside of the leaf down here is it's kind of a smooth surface, and then all these wavy pieces that are folded in among themselves with these spiky bits coming out. And I suppose as much as anything, I like this image because it's got this sort of smiley face appearance there. So we've got different colors here. There's some artificial stain added to highlight the chemical differences of these cells. You see that they have different sizes, different thicknesses, shapes, and so on. And so that's all tied in with their various functions. So just as in humans and other organisms, we have different cells that take on different functions. Plants do this too, as of course you probably expected. So when we talk about differentiation, we're talking about cells, as I said, starting from a more general purpose cell and becoming something specialized. And in plants, that's mostly a one-way trip. So you go from one generic cell and take on a particular shape and function depending on your position. And some illustrations here of cells that this is actually a cell that makes up a hair. This is a single plant cell, and it's become this part of a hair, and it's contributing to the function there. And it's just going to stay in place. So the plants are kind of building themselves a little bit more like putting something together with bricks. And the functions of the cells are pretty well fixed after they've differentiated. So you can see a few different kinds on here. These hairs made up of cells, these more pavement epidermis cells on the surface. And then these are pairs of guard cells that make up the stomata also on the surface there. So you can also get a feel for some function here. So if we start off with our generic illustration of a plant cell, this really is generic, and it's not the shape and structure that you would find in every plant cell, but it is kind of the general starting point for plant cells. So why should a cell differentiate? Well, of course, as we mentioned, they have different functions to do, and having a different shape, chemical composition, thickness, stiffness, all kinds of different things, features can make cells better able to do the particular functions. And then this other question, how? So when we talk about how cells differentiate, how do you take on a different shape, chemical composition, and so on? So we'll see some of these processes at work and focus on the end results of what happens after they've differentiated. So just kind of back to the overall plant overview. We're talking about cells today, but just to put them in context, they exist as part of the plant body. So we'll get into the structures of plants that are vegetative, as in not involved in sexual reproduction. So this does not involve the flowers or fruits or seeds, just the vegetative parts of the plant that are involved in mostly in photosynthesis, growth, gathering water, and so on. And when we talk about plants, they have three kinds of vegetative organs. So kind of a nice break from if you're learning about human anatomy and physiology, lots of different organs in the human body. In plants, we simplify it way down into three kinds of organs: roots, stems, and leaves. And those are the vegetative organs of a plant. 1, 2, 3. There also are three what we call tissue systems, and those are what are colored differently on this diagram. And the tissue systems are unified by kind of a shared function. So we have this tissue system called ground, kind of the general background cell type, that's in blue there. The dermal cell type, or actually, I don't know, I guess ground is in yellow, I should say. And then everything is covered in blue, which is the dermal tissue system. So dermal, like the skin, coating the surface of the leaves, the stems, and the roots, all surrounded in dermal tissue. And then vascular tissue, as we saw, this was a defining feature of these vascular plants. So the ferns and their relatives and the seed plants have vascular tissue. These are specialized cells for transporting water. And you can see they kind of line up like veins in a human body for transporting blood. This is similar structure for transporting water and then also transporting sugars throughout the body. So 3 organs, stems, roots, and leaves, and 3 tissue systems, ground, dermal, and vascular. And you'll notice that the 3 types of tissues here are present in all those different organs. So a leaf has dermal tissue, has ground tissue, has vascular tissue. Stem has dermal tissue, has ground tissue, has vascular tissue. Root has dermal, ground, vascular tissue. And that's what's highlighted on this illustration. Not too much different from what we saw, so just kind of gloss over this one real quick. Just showing cross sections through leaf, stem, and root of an example plant and the presence of these different tissues. The vascular tissue is made up of 2 kinds of cells called xylem and phloem. And their distribution is, there's kind of a consistent pattern in plants. So xylem on one side of the leaf, phloem on the other side of the leaf, and the stem, xylem toward the inside, phloem towards the outside, root. A little bit of variation in species with how the roots are put together, but the general theme is that xylem and phloem are often found very close to each other, often in what we call vascular bundles, which is illustrated here. So vascular bundles, collection of xylem and phloem together. So we've seen some diagrams of the cell types in these organs, and this is an actual cross section through a plant and kind of shows these features. When I was a student, they were, they'd have this up on the screen, and we were required to identify different kinds of cells. We do have some rather generic categories for cells, and mostly for this class, I want to just kind of focus on big picture stuff. So the epidermis is this layer of dermal cells. So on the very outside is a continuous layer of cellular protection. And then the red cells with the thick walls, these are another one that's also pretty easy to identify. Those are the xylem cells. They're red because you can apply a stain that stains the chemical composition of the cell wall, stains that red. And so these are pretty easy to identify. They're often big like this. These are the water conducting cells. So you can see there's kind of a zone here of xylem cells, and then a little bit of space, another zone of xylem cells. These are those vascular bundles, kind of in the flesh a little bit more. And then among the vascular bundles, mostly just these ground tissue cells. Again, a little bit more kinds of cells than we're really gonna dissect apart in this class. So we'll start in with ground tissue. And ground tissue, just kind of this, even the name kind of has this sense of filler, or I don't know, maybe not as vital a job, or not as, I don't know, not as specialized a job. So you might encounter grounding as something in electricity. So if you have a 3-prong outlet, one of those is the ground. And you got 2 prongs that really conduct the electricity. And the ground prong is there to keep things from, anyway. It doesn't actually like conduct the electricity as a source of power. And that's, I think, maybe a sense for what ground tissue is doing in plants, is it's sort of providing the background basis for the filler structure. And then in and among that are these more specialized cells of the water conducting cells. And so my example here of broccoli, a lot of what you're getting when you eat broccoli, this is one of our vegetables, so vegetative tissue, you're eating a lot of this filler tissue in the stem. And what's going on? How does that taste? What is it? Well, it's just plant stem structure. People have bred these plants to have bigger, fatter stem structure. They're edible, they're nutritious, they're not toxic to us. So good for us, and also filled with not just cells, but as we'll see, those cells can be a location where energy is stored by the plant. So they could be storing a little bit more starch in those cells than maybe other parts of the plant. One of the big jobs of ground tissue is that if cells need to differentiate, so some of them are differentiated as part of the normal programming of the plant as it grows, but every once in a while, say there's a wound that develops or a new kind of growth that has to happen in response to the environment, the source of new growth comes from ground cells. So the location of ground cells, they're kind of distributed all throughout the plant. Those cells can become new stems, new vascular tissue, new epidermis if need be. And so it's they've got a lot of potential, even though they're in most cases not doing much. And I like this illustration here. This is something that you can do in a lab, a nice sterile lab with particular chemical hormones. You can take bits of leaf and grow new plants out of it. So something researchers can do if you need to propagate something, say you've got a feature that you want to spread out vegetatively, you can take one plant and make more plants out of it. Sometimes you can do it under conditions like this, where they're actually just taking bits of leaf and growing new plants. So it gets a little bit messy. It doesn't quite look like much to begin with. It starts growing off as what's described as a callus. So this term here, callus, just sort of a lump of growth. And that's one of the early steps in this process. And then as it goes on, the cells start organizing themselves and getting the right signals, and they start developing leaves. You can see on this image, kind of a combination of that lumpy callus growth and then some leafy growth. And eventually, if this keeps going, those leafy bits are going to start developing into something that more familiar looks like a plant. So with roots and stems and leaves all into itself, and they can turn that into a new plant if they need to. One term here that you might encounter in the context of ground cells is parenchyma. And it's a term referring to one of these generic cell types. It's really the undifferentiated cell type is called parenchyma. So in this illustration down in the lower right, it talks about parenchyma cells as belonging to the ground tissue. And they're produced by the cell in the center that's called a meristematic cells. We'll see meristem, so it's sort of a stem cell plant version. And that one also you could classify as a parenchyma cell. So it's just a general purpose cell that can become other kinds of cells. So sometimes these terms are a little bit interchangeable. A lot of times the parenchyma cells, we're referring to these cells that have become just filler ground tissue cells. But they have the potential to do what the meristematic cell can do, which is to become phloem, part of the vascular system, to become xylem, which is part of the vascular system, to become other kinds of cells. So parenchyma. And parenchyma, as we've talked about, I just think of these cells as kind of the filler, juicy cells. And if you're a plant and you've got some structure to maintain, we saw when we talked about vacuoles in plant cells, how that vacuole was important for keeping the cell structure. So keeping just a reservoir of water allows these cells that are just sort of water bags, allows them to be filled up and more rigid and maintain the structure of the plant. So a lot of that is due to these parenchyma cells in the ground tissue. Another job for parenchyma cells is they can store nutrients. So some illustrations here of cells with the purple inclusions inside. This one has been stained with a stain that shows starch in purple. And you can see that inside of an individual cell, there's lots of these individual smaller starch grains in there. And starch is a stored version of carbohydrate. So this is a root cross section with a whole bunch of starch grains inside of each cell. A little bit closer zoom in on the starch storage inside of a cell. And then just as reference for the nutrients stored inside of a root, there are some of these roots that we eat and plenty of other roots that animals would eat. Good location for a plant to store nutrients if it needs to, say, overwinter and then grow from the stored energy in the root. This is a good place to store that energy in the ground tissue. So moving on to the next tissue system is the dermal system. And dermal tissue consists of the epidermis. So same term used in plants as in humans, basically the fancy word for skin. So in plants, the dermal tissue is just one layer of cells thick. So you can see it from the top. This is just looking down on the surface of a plant. You can see the cells sometimes take on an elongated shape like this. And then at regular intervals in there are these stomata. So stomata are an important component of the dermal system. They're there to let air in and out, and also they can close to prevent water from being lost if that's a danger for the plant. So stomata, cells packed together, and then outside of those cells is this, what's been stained on this right image is a waxy layer. So we've seen examples of how plants are very juicy, and a cell on its own is quite prone to losing moisture. But if it has a layer of wax toward the outside, that prevents the water from being lost outside of these cells. So outside of the cells, wax layer keeps the whole inside of this leaf wet. So a little more detail on that waxy layer. It has a technical name called cuticle. So the cuticle for a plant is this waxy structure. It's sort of a matrix of, as you can see here, some waxes, carbohydrates, and so on. So here on this image, way inside of that is the plasma membrane. So the actual membrane of this plant cell, cell walls, of course. And then so to the outside of the cell wall, this plant is putting out a whole bunch of waxes. So hydrophobic, solid phase waxes that prevent water from being lost from the inside. Also can give you some of these interesting features where water that lands on a plant doesn't go through the leaves. So a lot of times if plants get water on them, the water beads up, kind of highlights that hydrophobic quality of the epidermis. And also, I guess, illustrates, if you were wondering where all plants could get their water from, they're really not built to collect water from their leaves. So you might have a plant that is getting lots of water on its leaves. It still needs to take the water into the plant body through the roots. And it's not really going to get in through the leaves. Oops. So a little more detail about the cuticle. You can have plants with different amounts of cuticle. Kind of highlights the resistance to drying out. So it's a little bit of an investment, and this kind of highlights plants that can grow in different areas. If they grow in a place that's not prone to drying out, it might not be so important for them to have a thick cuticle. But if you have a plant that grows in dry areas, having a thick cuticle can be extra important. So some of your like succulent houseplants have pretty thick, waxy cuticles that protect them from drying out, because in their natural environment, that's something they encounter a little bit more. And this little article down here highlights something about the research of studying cuticles, learning about features that might be sort of bred into or artificially engineered into plants to make them more resistant to droughts. So this is a type of grass that has these glaucous, so with lots of cuticle, glaucous versions, not so much cuticle in the non-glaucous versions, and these ones with a lot more cuticle are resistant to drought. And that's definitely something appealing to people in parts of the world where their fields might be drying out. We saw the stomata a lot before. We talked about the vacuole and how that's related to making the stomata open or close. That's just a repeat of that illustration we saw before. So an individual stoma is one of these so-called mouths, and it's got two guard cells making up the mouth, and they can push against each other to open or relax to close. And I like this illustration because it really does show you also the waxy layer there. So there's this orangish kind of color, yellow, is the wax on top. It's covering, it's in between all these cells. And inside of this stoma, you can kind of get a glimpse at the not so waxy delicate inner layer that could be losing moisture. A little bit more about stomata. So we saw some various distributions of stomata on the leaf surface, typically found on leaves and often found on the underside of leaves. So on this right-hand illustration, there's a stoma on the top layer, but also on the bottom layer here. So as these cells allow gas exchange to happen, on the underside of the leaf, it's a little bit more desirable to let the air in and out on the underside. That would be the shaded side of the leaf in most cases. And so it's not as likely for the heat of the sun to cause water in here to evaporate, as opposed to the upper surface, that's more of a concern. So on a lot of leaves, if you looked at the distribution of stomata on the top surface versus the lower surface, you'd see a lot more on the lower surface. So I suspect a lot of these might be showing us the lower surface. And stomata, also an indicator of environmental conditions. So we saw the cuticle is sometimes thicker in places where it's drier. Stomata, the density of stomata is pretty reliably an indicator of the availability of carbon dioxide. So if you think about it, these are here for the purpose of letting carbon dioxide in so that plants can do photosynthesis. And over a long span of time, these are millions of years, 600 million years ago, you can study fossils of plants. So they have fossil plant leaf surfaces with stomata on them, and basically count the density of stomata. And that tells you that if there's more carbon dioxide in the air, the plant doesn't need as many stomata to let CO2 in for photosynthesis. So the benefit here is that you can use this stomatal density to try and recreate past climates. So we don't have a lot of evidence necessarily about what kinds of climate existed in the past, how warm it was, how much CO2 was in the air. But researchers have inferred the abundance of CO2 based on the density of stomata and get a graph kind of like this, the relative amount of CO2 in the past, changing over time. And a very important conversation piece these days, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Another feature of the epidermis is that some of these epidermal cells can grow out into hairs. The fancy name for plant hairs is trichomes. And they're put together a lot differently than animal hairs. So your hairs on your head and arms, those hairs are not alive. They're not made out of cells. They're just like a protein excretion, excretion from your body. In plants, their hairs are actually made up of cells, and we'll see them on a microscopic level, which means that they can take on a little bit of some functions that are would not be possible for our hairs, for example. So on this plant on the right, these hairs are tipped with a gland. So they got a kind of a red color to them. They are alive, they're juicy, and they're able to respond to the environment by putting something sticky in there, or sometimes glands are involved in producing scents or toxins or something like that. So having something alive in your hair layer can give you a nice benefit. The hairs were alive when they were made, not guaranteed to stay alive. I suspect the cells in this center image and the one on the left, they're probably not alive at the moment, but they would have started as living cell hairs. So lots of different kinds of hairs. As I mentioned, the ones with glands on them can be used to secrete scents or toxins or attractants or something sticky to entrap an animal visitor. And some of them are, we saw cases where seeds are dispersed with like hooked hairs to grab onto animal fur. Some of them maybe a deterrent to animal chewing on the leaf surface of a plant. So just a really wide variety here. And I like this left-hand image, shows a few different kinds. So some long, thick spine hairs. Those are just made of just hairs again. Uh, it's on a microscopic level, so this isn't something you terribly see with your naked eye, but it would be a good deterrent against an insect. And then also threw out some multicellular hairs, different sizes, some kind of glandular on there. So lots going on, lots of potential for what plants can do with their hairs. Some of them you might be familiar with as a little more extreme cases of hair modifications. So the stinging nettle plant. This is the plant, and this is what its hairs look like down in the bottom center. They're basically like little glass hypodermic needles. So they're stiff and sharp, and they're hollow on the inside, except that they have a liquid toxin in there, formic acid. So as you brush up against these, if these pierce your skin, then your juicy insides that have been pierced take up this acid chemical into your body, and it's a really good deterrent for anybody who gets too close to this one. So a good deterrent for animals brushing up against stinging nettle, gets them to avoid it and certainly think twice about chewing on it. Another plant that's got some specialized hairs is the Venus flytrap. And I think maybe on the PowerPoint file, you'll be able to view this image, but you can watch a video online of Venus flytrap using its hairs to sense the presence of animals that it should close its traps onto. This one caught my attention because this was the group that I've studied a lot as my research. A plant called the bog bean, Manyanthus, has flowers with hairs on the flowers. And there's been some hypotheses about why they're there. Could be to keep water out of the flowers. This is an aquatic plant. And then this study actually found that the hairs are useful for keeping animals in the flower for longer. And why might that be valuable? Think about it. One potential value to having animals in your flower longer is that they have longer time to get pollen on them, or if they've already got pollen, give them a longer time to maybe dust that onto the female structure. So at any rate, definitely a significant contribution of hairs to keeping animals in there for longer, including this ant here. And then I guess I can't mention trichomes without coming around to this plant. If you ever do a web search on trichomes, you're likely to pull up images of cannabis. So this is the, what do I want to say, recreational drug, medicinal drug, cannabis, marijuana. And what people like from cannabis is this chemical THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, and it's produced on these glandular hairs. So if you want more of the active chemical in your cannabis, you want more of these glands. And so the cultivated varieties of cannabis are just really dense with these glandular hairs. So more than you'd find in a wild cannabis plant. And that's probably the most desirable feature. So you get some really extreme gland density on some of these. Just a few images as we're going through rather extravagant hairs. I don't know. I think they're just really neat. It's something you don't often see with your naked eye. And there's just lots of diversity. And you could hypothesize a little bit about the functions of these different hairs.